Pokemon needs no introduction. It's more than just a legendary IP, it's a cross-cultural icon. And I haven't engaged with it at all since the 3DS era. The early 3DS era. The last title I played was Pokemon X, and although it's my understanding that Gen 6 is generally considered to be one of the less popular ones, it wasn't a particular drop in quality that made me quit Pokemon after I played it. After all, I never even picked up Omega Ruby or Alpha Sapphire, and I have titanic levels of nostalgia for the original Gen 3 games. So what gave? Well, at some point, its total lack of evolution, pun not intended, began to become genuinely distracting. And as I grew older and my taste in both RPGs and games in general expanded and grew more refined, I began to notice some of Pokemon's more inelegant traits which had been there all along. Now, I completely acknowledge that Pokemon is and has always been aimed at children, and the inherent simplicity of its design is highly conducive to that. But I want you to try a thought experiment with me. Let's pretend a big RPG publisher like Square Enix or Atlas held a press conference today in the year 2023 and unveiled a brand new IP. Let's pretend they showed off the combat system at this hypothetical presentation, and let's imagine that this was the combat system. The game is turn-based. You have 6 party members, but only one of them can be on the field at any given time. Additionally, all engagements are 1v1s, and both you and your opponent only have access to a selection of 4 actions. You would think they had lost their minds. From their very inception, RPGs have reveled in their relative complexity. Involved stories with interesting characters, juggling multiple party members against a mob of enemies who outnumber you, and selecting from an entire lunch menu's worth of options in how you choose to deal with them. Now, I don't mean to imply that no Pokemon game has ever had an appealing narrative, and I do see the appeal of the age-old journey to be the very best like no one ever was, but at some point I just lost interest in the recycled, simplistic premises and the brain-dead, simple combat. As a millennial, I've been with this series since Gen 1, and the single-player experience of Pokemon basically never evolved at all, barring some quality-of-life improvements with overworld exploration. Opponent trainers never had an interesting variety of team compositions to contend with, and CPU-controlled boss characters almost never so much as switched out a Pokemon strategically. Picking the right Pokemon for a given situation is borderline mindless. Did the opponent send out a fire type? Use a water type. Did they send out a grass type? Use a fire type. By Gen 6, I was all but one-shotting every single gym leader's entire team, and it didn't require anything more than the most rudimentary understanding of the game's most surface-level mechanics. But Duck, you're saying. Pokemon's all about the multiplayer, baby. It's about picking your favorite Mons for a personalized team and taking them online. To which I say, well, yes, but actually no. Here we get into what is likely my hottest take in the video, but while Pokemon's multiplayer offerings have arguably grown fairly considerably, by Gen 6 they had begun to frustrate me in an entirely different way. I originally wanted to make an entire video dedicated to this point alone, but I realized that what I'm about to say is basically all I have to say about it, so here goes. We live in the age of the internet, which has been both a blessing and a curse to us all, as a species. The thing about the internet in the context of Pokemon is that while it opened the floodgates for online trading and battling, it also gave birth to the bane of my existence. It's called the meta. Not to be a millennial boomer about this, but when I was a kid and the internet was not as fundamental a part of everyone's daily lives as it is now, the sharing of niche information about aspects of a game's deeper mechanics wasn't really a thing. Being largely restricted to playing and battling Pokemon with only people you knew personally may have limited your partner options, but it also meant you could just have fun playing a game your way. True player self-expression was much more commonplace because nobody had to contend with dominant strategies just to stand a statistical chance with some rando online. In my opinion, and again, I realize what a hot take this is, the proliferation of the meta across the internet has been a double-edged sword. Broadly, and perhaps even objectively speaking, it's a good thing. As a species, our science and even art has evolved over time thanks to mass exposure to older discoveries and works and the fine-tuning of pre-established inventions and concepts. Long-distance transportation and communication technology have only improved as much as they have because the most brilliant minds in the world have had the opportunity to pool their cognitive resources. Actors have gotten better as well. In the early days of television and cinema, things like crying on cue used to be a rare skill, possessed only by the exceptional few, and yet nowadays it's practically a prerequisite to doing any kind of high-profile screen work. But games are different. They're supposed to be leisure activities. They were intended for fun. Competitive aspects have always existed, but once upon a time you could challenge a friend, or even a friend of a friend, to an impromptu Pokemon battle and not have to worry about protecting against a Rattata Fear Sweep, or the fact that your team didn't have a Garchomp and a Blissey in it. Nobody worried about all their Pokemon being born with perfect IVs, training the precise EVs they needed for a competitively viable build, and making sure their shitty special attacker had a modest nature or whatever. See, for me, the proliferation of the meta sucked all the fun out of competitive Pokemon. I'm sure for many people it's been a great thing. There are those who really enjoy a grind, and getting into a game's deepest, most nitty-gritty mechanics, and then still having a huge pool of worthy adversaries to pit their excruciatingly sculpted team against. But for me, it made Pokemon into a chore, into a job. If I didn't want to put in the work, then fuck me, I guess, because everyone and their wet dog was rocking a Gengar with perfect IVs and a Cloyster so tanky it could withstand a nuclear explosion, even against its own weakness. And in a game where every turn is a 1v1 bout, there's no actual skill or dexterity involved in determining the order in which actions resolve. He who has the highest speed stat just goes first, with that first strike being way too important in 1v1. Pokemon definitely has more strategy in its PvP aspects, but at the end of the day, it's more about mind games than anything else, because nobody wants to leave a Charizard in front of a Blastoise, and this weird will they won't they switch their Pokemon out guessing game is just not fun for me. When I play a game with strategic battling, I want a playing field where all of my and my opponent's units are on the board, no holds barred. Not pussyfooting around elemental weaknesses as the entire rest of my team sits totally protected in some pocket dimension. Honestly, my problems with the meta even extend to action games like Smash Bros. I know I keep saying this, but again, when I was a kid, people actually had this thing called a play style. Everyone's was unique. It was like a snowflake or a fingerprint. Often, you could identify a player without even seeing who was behind the controller, based on the way they handled their characters. And while I'm sure this phenomenon technically still exists among professional Smash players to a degree, professional play honestly just looks like an absolute cluster to me. The kinds of play you see in tournaments are these ridiculous distortions of what the game looks like in an organic environment. The kinds of fights which existed in a world without the internet. Professional Smash is a bizarre spectacle in which everyone dash dances around at light speed like they're on crack, and then dip in to throw out a frame-perfect, imperceptible hurtbox, only to either retreat or lead into some convoluted, inescapable combo, and it's so uncanny and artificial to watch. If you've ever been fortunate enough to just casually play the game with a friend or at a party without being such a try-hard, then I think you'll know what I mean when I call professional play bizarre and artificial looking. Again, this is a personal hang-up of mine, not an objective issue, but I don't want to have to take a freaking college-level course in Smash just to be able to play online with randos and withstand the onslaught of 50,000 little disciples of Hungrybox and Mewtwo King. Sue me. Honestly, I'm incredibly lucky that I still have a small group of friends with a variety of Smash skill levels hovering around my own, or that wonderful franchise would have been all but dead to me long ago. Anyway, what was I talking about? Oh yeah, why don't play Pokemon anymore? So, the thing with Pokemon is that the single player is tuned for literal babies, and the multiplayer has devolved into this insane galaxy-brained metafest where you can't even make a balanced team of Pokemon that you like because there are a small subset of functional equivalents which have objectively superior stats, and literally everyone on the planet who's playing online knows who they are. What's interesting, though, is that unlike with others I've left behind, Pokemon isn't a series which I walked away from and never looked back at. I mean, I did walk away, but I'm always looking back at it, keeping an eye on it. The concept is timeless, and it's remained as popular as it has for a reason, even if not for the effort actually put into it by Game Freak. Pokemon are just hella marketable and crazy appealing. Even despite all my gripes with the modern meta, I still vividly remember why I used to love these games, and I've been waiting and wanting for Game Freak to produce something, anything that can win me back over. Create a world as beautiful and detailed and immersive to explore as something like Breath of the Wild. They did something like that, but Legends of Arceus de-emphasized the battling of all things, and had bosses which involved chucking little hacky sacks around until you'd be allowed to have a couple turns at actually fighting them. Scarlet and Violet looked super promising, as I've wanted an open-world Pokemon game since I was a little kid, but then Game Freak went and completely missed the point by not having the gym leaders scale with your badge count. That was a deal breaker for me. It is the reason I didn't pick that game up. I mean, Game Freak, look, I understand if you can't make a unique team per badge for every single enemy trainer in the overworld, but for the love of God, if the gym leaders don't scale, then your game is basically just linear anyway. Except worse, because now the player has to look up what order to visit towns in rather than just being led to them organically in-game. This is embarrassing design. So yeah, all this is, in a nutshell, why I don't play Pokemon games anymore. The developers don't put in nearly enough effort, and the player base puts in way too much effort. The game is too simplistic in the single player and too masochistic and constrained in the multiplayer. There's just no healthy in-between for me. The silver lining to all this, however, is that my disenfranchisement with Pokemon after X and Y led me to spend the last 10 years branching out and exploring some absolutely top-notch alternatives to fill my monster-taming RPG itch. Shin Megami Tensei, for one, is a series that I'm still kicking myself for passing on for as long as I had. It isn't multiplayer-oriented, but it's basically Pokemon meets Fallout with a foundation in real-world folklore and religion, and each entry manages to be fresh and engaging despite most sharing a similar premise. World of Final Fantasy was also an excellent one-off adventure for any Final Fantasy fans looking for more cutesy and cozy monster taming quest. It even had a surprisingly good narrative. Of course, if you're looking for engagement on both the single-player and multiplayer level, you can't go wrong with Dragon Quest Monsters, which combines the appealing monster designs of Akira Toriyama with the complexity of managing an actual team of units ranging from 2 to 4, with smaller teams being a concession for use of a larger, more powerful monster. Or, if you're less into Dragon Quest but have some massive millennial nostalgia for Digimon, the Digimon story games are basically Digimon's take on Dragon Quest Monsters combat, complete with multiplayer offerings. I'm sure these games have a meta. Basically any and everything with a competitive element in this day and age does, but even just having 3 or so units out on the battlefield at once, with each having access to more than a paltry 4 moves, makes it infinitely easier to actually get a little creative and still have a decent shot, without needing to study some tournament player's dissertation before even going online. In short, even without Pokemon, there are a myriad of more complex and frankly better designed monster taming RPGs out there for people to tinker with. I'll keep Pokemon in my periphery, but I'm eating perfectly good in the meantime. And that's all I have to say about that. If you've made it here to the end of the video, then thanks for sticking around and listening to me complain about not wanting to get good for the last 10 or so minutes. If you enjoyed the video, you know the algorithm things to do, but regardless, please let me know what you thought in the comments. There's evidence of this on every video on this channel, but I really do actively engage with my audience on this platform, so if you write something, I will see it, and I'll always respond if I have something to say about it. Have a great day, and I hope to see you back here. Peace out. Oh yeah, and I don't like VTubers.